Lit.
Ahuru comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Akile Anai, the Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. Make sure to hit that like button and share this video from the platform you're viewing from. This week, Chairman Omali Yeshitela continues a study on dialectical materialism. He will read from Materialism in the Dialectical Method by Maurice Cornforth, starting at the top of page 54 with the subhead 6, Dialectics and Metaphysics. The study materials have been linked in the Facebook and YouTube descriptions for your benefit. For the first hour, the chairman will review the study materials, and in the second hour, we'll open it up to you, our live viewers, to ask your questions. It's my honor now to introduce our leadership, the leader of the African nation and the worldwide African revolution, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru, thank you so much, Comrade Director Akile. Today, as this has been stated, we're going to talk about dialectics and metaphysics. As we know, over the last few weeks, we've been discussing the question of materialism and the dialectical method. The last few weeks, we've dealt primarily with the question of materialism versus idealism. And as we will be talking about dialectics, and we will be talking about materialism, the fact is that materialism is defined in opposition to idealism, and dialectics will be defined in opposition to metaphysics. So this discussion we'll be having today deals essentially with dialectics and metaphysics. I've suggested that it would be a good idea for people to really look at much of this on your own, and even between studies and subsequent to studies, and especially if you use what we've talked about up to now as a part of your method of studying this, and being able to look at things that I've written from political reports, et cetera, that brings this really down to earth, this whole issue of dialectical materialism, down to earth, practical application is expressed in the political reports. That's important. And I want to suggest that you really look at this also because in the first part of February 8th through 11th, if I'm not mistaken, the third plenary of our party's seventh Congress will be occurring. And I'm going to try and expedite this process that we're engaged in now, this discussion, so that I can move toward looking at the political report for that plenary. I'd like to have at least a month or so to be able to read and discuss the political report to the plenary, which allows members of the party and others who would like to our movement to have an opportunity to prepare for the plenary. There were issues that you will have to report on. In many ways, in many instances, the political report is referred to as the main resolution. So this is the primary defining resolution of the entire plenary. But many of you have your own reports to make, and I know that you've already begun working, and probably I know at least one person has completed her report. But it'd be helpful perhaps to have access to this main resolution, the political report that I'm working on now, so that it will facilitate the development of what it is that you're doing, and gives you an opportunity also to come to the plenary prepared to debate any kinds of issue revolving around the political report, which you will also have an opportunity to vote on in terms of whether or not it's accepted or whether or not it has to be changed or rejected altogether. So again, this is going to be February 8th through the 11th. That's where the third plenary of the 7th Congress of our party will be occurring. And I'm really calling on you now to take as much, to spend as much time as you can studying this now, so that we will have an opportunity to discuss the political report that's being prepared for the plenary. So dialectics and metaphysics. Dialectics, and we're on, again, page 54. Dialectics as a method of investigation, a method of thinking, is opposed to metaphysics. The metaphysical way of thinking deals with abstractions. It considers things each by itself in abstraction from their real conditions of existence and interconnections. And it considers things as fixed and frozen in abstraction from their real change and development. Consequently, it invents rigid formulas and is always posing hard and fast antitheses, either or. It fails to comprehend the unity and struggle of opposite processes and tendencies manifested in all phenomena of nature and society. In contrast to metaphysics, the aim of dialectics is to trace the real changes and interconnections in the world, and to think of things always in their real motion and interconnection. Dialectical materialism, the world outlook of the Marxist-Leninist party, Cornforth, is materialist in its theory, its interpretation, and explanation of everything, and dialectical in its method. Dialectical materialism is materialist in its theory, its interpretation and explanation of everything, dialectical in its method. We have seen how materialist explanation is opposed to idealist explanation. And then we saw how materialists formally interpreted everything in a mechanist way, but how mechanistic materialism proved inadequate to explain real processes of change and development. For this, we need materialist dialectics. We need to study and understand things dialectically. The dialectical method is indeed nothing but the method of studying and understanding things in their real change and development. As such, it stands opposed to metaphysics. What is metaphysics? Or more exactly, what is the metaphysical way of thinking, which is opposed by the dialectical way of thinking? Metaphysics is essentially an abstract way of thinking. In a sense, all thinking is abstract, since it works with general concepts and cannot but disregard a great deal of particular and unessential detail. For example, if we say that men have two legs, we are thinking of the two-leggedness of men in abstraction from their other properties, such as having a head, two arms, and so on. And similarly, we are thinking of all men in general, disregarding the individuality of particular men, of Peter, Paul, and so on. But there is abstraction and abstraction. Metaphysics is distinguished by the fact that it makes false, misleading abstractions. As Engels once pointed out, the art of working out concepts is not inborn, but requires real thought. The art of right thinking involves learning how to avoid metaphysical abstraction. Okay. I think as we move forward, you're going to see how this metaphysical way of thinking is much more common than we think about it, particularly when it's applied to political life and political theory and concept, and most often political life and theory and concepts as advanced by those who characterize themselves as dialectical or historical materialists. So suppose, for example, we are thinking about men, how about human, quote unquote, human nature. Then we should think about human nature in such a way that we recognize that men live in society and that their human nature cannot be independent of their living in society, but develops and changes with the development of society. We shall then form ideas about human nature which correspond to the actual conditions of men's existence and to their change and development. But yet people often think about human nature in a different way, as though there were such a thing as human nature, which manifests itself quite independent of the actual conditions of human existence, and which was always and everywhere exactly the same. To think in such a way is obviously to make a false, misleading abstraction. And it is just such an abstract way of thinking that we call metaphysics. And, when we hear that it's just human nature to do such and such a thing, to act in such and such a way, that somebody stole something because it was there in his human nature. If you see an opportunity to get something, one does it, etc. This is part of what we're talking about, like false and misleading abstractions. When we try and deal with human nature without looking at the existence, the relationships that people have in society, that human beings have in society, the nature of the society that we're looking at at any given time. When you talk about, so the concept of fixed, unchanging human nature is an example of metaphysical abstraction, of the metaphysical way of thinking. The metaphysician does not think in terms of real men, but of man in the abstract. Metaphysics, or the metaphysical way of thinking, is then that way of thinking which thinks of things, one, an abstraction from their conditions of existence, and two, an abstraction from their change and development. It thinks of things, one, in separation one from another, ignoring their interconnections, and two, as fixed and frozen, ignoring their change and development. One example of metaphysics has already been given. It is not difficult to find plenty more. Indeed, the metaphysical way of thinking is so widespread and has become so much part and parcel of current bourgeois ideology that there is hardly an article in a journal, a talk on the radio, or a book by a learned professor in which examples of metaphysical fallacy are not to be found. A good deal is said and written, for example, about democracy, but the speakers and writers usually refer to some pure or absolute democracy, which they seek to define an abstraction from the actual development of society, of classes, and of class struggle. But there can be no such pure democracy. It is a metaphysical abstraction. If we want to understand democracy, we have to always ask, democracy for whom? For the exploiters or the exploited? We have to understand that since democracy is a form of government, there is no democracy which is not associated with the rule of some particular class, and that the democracy which is established when the working class is the ruling class is a higher form of democracy than capitalist democracy, just as capitalist democracy is a higher form of democracy than, say, the slave owners' democracy of ancient Greece. In other words, we should not try to think of democracy in abstraction from real social relations and from the real change and development of society. Yet, brothers and sisters, this is something that we are confronted with all the time, because there is this built-in tendency to perceive the world and justice and democracy and things like that from the perspective of the colonial society that we live in. There is this is something that we're always having to deal with, and we'll say a little more about this moving forward. According to Cornforth, again, pacifists try to base their opposition to war on the idea that all wars are wrong. They think of war in the abstract without reflecting that the character of each particular war is determined according to the historical epoch, the aims of the war, and the classes in whose interests it is fought. Consequently, they fail to distinguish between imperialist wars and wars of liberation, between unjust war and just wars. We run into that often when we are talking to pacifists, and it is something that's most conveniently put forth, but not always, by white colonizers, by liberals, et cetera, who are opposed to violence, they say, and who opposed to war because all war is bad and all violence is bad, et cetera. Without taking into consideration, of course, that colonialism and living under colonial mode of production is living under conditions of violence all the time. So to say that to fight against that is violence is to negate the reality that violence is always being imposed on the colonized. Every aspect of life under colonialism is violent and imposed by violence. And so when people strike out against that violence, then that is just struggle. We recognize that is revolutionary violence that is justified by its intent to end the violence that's imposed on the whole people, certainly by all the colonized people by the violence of the colonialism and colonial society. And then Cornforth goes further here by telling us that in most British schools today, the children are regularly subjected to what they call intelligence tests. It is alleged that each child possesses a certain fixed quantity of intelligence, which can be estimated without regard to the actual conditions of the child's existence and which determines his capabilities throughout the whole of his life, regardless of whatever conditions for change and development may subsequently come in his way. This is another example of metaphysics. In this case, the metaphysical conception of intelligence is used as an excuse for denying educational opportunities to the majority of children on the grounds that their intelligence is too low for them to benefit from such opportunities. This is an interesting statement for a lot of different reasons. And this whole thing about the problem that Cornforth is recognizing here is that this intelligence test is used as this conception, this metaphysical conception of intelligence is used as an excuse for denying educational opportunities to the majority of children on the grounds that their intelligence is too low for them to benefit from such opportunities. And of course, the problem here is that Cornforth puts forth the question of education and denial of education in a manner that suggests that all education is good, that the education of the colonized is good for the colonized, so that even if you get good education, even if the colonized is afforded the opportunity to have education similar to the colonizer, the problem continues to be that their education is not good in general. The education of the colonizer does not serve the interests of the education of the colonized. And this is another way we're looking at metaphysics, even when those who are teaching us about metaphysics falls into the trap of a metaphysical approach to things. So in general, metaphysics is a way of thinking which tries to fix the nature, properties, and potentialities of everything it considers once and for all. Consequently, it presupposes that each thing has a fixed nature and fixed properties. And it thinks in terms of things rather than of processes. It tries to sum up everything in a formula, which says the whole world or any part of the world which is under consideration consists of just such and such things with such and such properties. Such a formula we may call a metaphysical formula. Thus, Engels refers to the old method of investigation and thought, which Hegel calls metaphysical, which preferred to investigate things as given, as fixed and stable. In philosophy, metaphysics often means the search for the ultimate constituent of the universe. Thus, the materialists who said that the ultimate constituents were small, solid, material particles were just as much metaphysicians as the idealists who said that the ultimate constituents were spirits. All such philosophers thought they could sum up the ultimate nature of the universe in some formula. Some have held this formula, some that, but all have been metaphysicians. Yet it has been a hopeless quest. We cannot sum up the whole infinite changing universe in any such formula. And the more we find out about it, the more is this evident. It should now be clear that the mechanistic materialism, which we discussed in the preceding chapters, can equally be called metaphysical materialism. We may also note in passing that certain philosophers today, the so-called positivists, claim to be against metaphysics because they claim to reject any philosophy which seeks for the ultimate constituents of the universe. For them, metaphysics mean any theory which deals with ultimates, not verifiable in sense experience. By using the term in this way, they conceal the fact that they themselves are, if anything, more metaphysical than any other philosophers, for their own mode of thinking reaches extremes of metaphysical abstractions. What could be more metaphysical than to imagine, as the positivist philosophers do, that our sense experience exists in abstraction from the real material world outside us? Indeed, they themselves make sense experience into a metaphysical ultimate. In opposition to the abstract metaphysical way of thinking, dialectics teach us to think of things in their real change and interconnection. To think dialectically is to think concretely, and to think concretely is to think dialectically. When we oppose the dialectical method to metaphysics, then we show up the inadequacy, one-sidedness, or falsity of the abstractions of metaphysics. This consideration enables us to understand the original meaning of the term dialectics. The word is derived from the Greek dialego, meaning to discuss or debate. It was considered that to discuss a question from all sides and from all angles, allowing different one-sided points of view to oppose and contradict each other during the debate was the best method of arriving at the truth. Such was the dialectics employed, for example, by Socrates. When anyone claimed to have a formula which answered some question once and for all, Socrates would enter into discussion with him, and by forcing him to consider the question from different angles, would compel him to contradict himself and so to admit that his formula was false. By this method, Socrates considered that it was possible to arrive at more adequate ideas about things. The Marxist dialectical method develops from and includes dialectics in the sense in which it was understood by the Greeks, but it is far richer in content, far wider in its scope. As a result, it becomes something qualitatively new as compared with pre-Marxist dialectics, a new revolutionary method, for it is combined with a consistent materialism and ceases to be a mere method of argument, becoming a method of investigation applicable to both nature and society, a method of materialist understanding of the world, which grows out of and guides the activity of changing the world. The metaphysical either or. Metaphysics presupposes that each thing has its own fixed nature, its own fixed properties, and considers each thing by itself in isolation. It tries to settle the nature and properties of each thing as a given, separate object of investigation, not considering things in their interconnection and in their change and development. I think that as we move further through this, we'll see, more concretely what's being talked about here. There's a lot of verbiage here that it boils down to the fact that dialectics just doesn't see things as separate and we've talked about this before, but it sees the things as part of a process where a process, it looks at processes where things do exist, and they exist in part of a process of coming into existence and dying out of existence. And they exist in relationship to all other things. That to try and abstract something and take it out of this, and to do this and take it out of its relationship with all other things in a particular process is a metaphysical way of looking at things. And so that's what it is that all of this boils down to. So because of this, metaphysics thinks of things in terms of hard and fast antithesis. It opposes things of one sort to things to another sort. If a thing is of one sort, it has one set of properties. If of another sort, it has another set of properties. The one excludes the other, and each is thought of in separation from the other, which is the wrong way of looking at it. So thus Engels writes, quote, to the metaphysician, things and their mental images, ideas are isolated to be considered one after the other, apart from each other, rigid, fixed objects of investigation given once and for all. He thinks in absolutely irreconcilable antithesis. His communication is yea, yea, nay, nay, for whatever is more of thee than these cometh of evil. For him, a thing either exists or it does not exist. It is equally impossible for a thing to be itself and at the same time something else. This is the metaphysical way of seeing stuff that Engels is criticizing in this statement. So philosophers, according to Cornforth, philosophers have expressed the essence of this metaphysical way of thinking in the formula. Each thing is what it is and not another thing. This may sound no more than plain common sense, but that only shows that so-called common sense itself conceals misleading ideas which need to be brought into the open. This way of thinking prevents us from studying things in their real changes and interconnections and all their contradictory aspects and relationships in their process of changing from one thing into another thing. It is not only philosophers who are metaphysicians. There are left-wing trade unionists, for example. Here Cornforth takes us into British politics and stuff like that. And things he's about to criticize right now may or may not be accurate, but he's using this as an example. There are left-wing trade unionists, for example, who are as metaphysical as any school of philosophers. For them, everyone at their trade union local meeting is either a class-conscious militant or else he's a right-wing opportunist. Everyone must fit into one or other category. And that is a real serious contradiction. And once he is down as right-wing, he's finished, so far as they're concerned. That some worker who has been their opponent in the past and on some issues may yet prove an ally in the future, and on other issues is not allowed for in their metaphysical outlook of life. I want to go back to that because there is truth to be found here, and we see this in our work all the time. And we see people who have a permanent stance of condemnation of somebody for a stance or a position they took in one instance at one time, et cetera, and how they should be viewed thereafter. So it says, how it reads here that for them, everyone at their trade union local meeting is either class-conscious militant or else he's a right-wing opportunist. Everyone must fit into one or other category. And once he is down as right-wing, he is finished so far as they are concerned. That some worker who has been their opponent in the past and on some issues may yet prove an ally in the future and on other issues are not allowed for in their metaphysical outlook of life. In one of Molière's plays, there's a man who learns for the first time about prose. When they explain to him what prose is, he explains why I've been speaking prose all my life. Similarly, there are many workers who may well say why I've been a metaphysician all my life. The metaphysician has this formula ready for everything. The metaphysician has his formula ready for everything. He says either this formula fits or it does not. If it does, that settles it. If it does not, then he has some alternative formula ready. Either or, but not both, is his motto. A thing is either this or that. It has either this set of properties or that set of properties. Two things stand to one another, either in this relationship or in that. The use of metaphysical either or leads people into countless difficulties. For example, difficulties are felt in understanding the relations between American and British imperialism today. For it is argued, either they are working together or else they are not. If they are working together, then there's no rift between them. If there's a rift between them, then they are not working together. But on the contrary, they are working together, and yet there are rifts between them. And we cannot understand the way they work together nor fight them effectively unless we understand the rifts which divide them. Again, difficulties are felt in understanding the possibility of the peaceful coexistence of capitalist and socialist states. For it is argued, either they can coexist peacefully, in which case antagonism between capitalism and socialism must cease, or else the antagonism remain, in which case they cannot coexist peacefully. But on the contrary, the antagonisms remain, and yet the strivings of the socialist state and the millions of people in all countries for peace can prevent a war between capitalist and socialist states. And then Cornforth now is really discussing a political position that was promoted in a very serious way from the Soviet Union at the time of this writing, where the Soviet Union and the what was considered the Communist International, its remnants at the time, was entering into various kinds of relations of peaceful coexistence with the capitalist powers, specifically the United States. And a problem here, of course, is how the old concept of what communism, socialism has deteriorated by the time Cornforth is writing this. And the concept has deteriorated in part because of an error that was made in defining how communism or as will socialism comes into being in the first place. And without given due consideration or recognition to the fact that the material basis or the historical basis for the rise of communism or socialism is to be found in the destruction of the colonial pedestal upon which the whole capitalist, the whole capitalist system operates. And because this was not understood, because they were not African internationalists and had access to this understanding, then what they saw occurring defied the outcome that was supposed to have come from the Marxist analysis, and they found themselves making different kinds of concessions to capitalism because we had a situation not where communist that the communist society had evolved, but from some historical process where there was no real historical basis, material basis for the rise of communism, but the social conditions or the political conditions under which communists or socialists took power. And that's the difference. And socialists took power in particular countries that existed within a world economy, a colonial capitalist world economy. The fact that colonialism still was the foundation of the capitalist system was something that was not taken into consideration and created confusion, and in some instances, an element of corruption within what would be what was considered communist countries or socialist countries, because they couldn't be genuinely communist societies, countries, et cetera, precisely because the dominant and prevailing social system continued to be capitalism rested upon the base of colonialism. In other words, colonial capitalism continued to be the dominant social system. And so we had a situation where since the communism that they had expected to come into existence using what they characterized as Marxist analyses, it didn't come into existence, and capitalism still prevailed, and capitalism was able to prevail. Why? Because it rested upon a foundation of colonialism, because it was always able to transfer all of the contradictions inherent in that kind of society to the colonial foundation. So the colonized always experienced the brunt of the contradiction in that society because it was colonial capitalism. So they didn't get the socialism or the communism that they thought was going to happen, and ended up making compromises with between what they characterize as the communist and socialist and communist states. And so this is where they talk about the coexistence, peaceful coexistence between the different states. Say, it is often difficult to avoid a metaphysical way of thinking. And this is because, misleading as it is, it yet has its roots in something very necessary and useful. It is necessary for us to classify things, to have some system of classifying them and assigning their properties and relations. That is a prerequisite of clear thinking. We have to work out what different kinds of things there are in the world. To say that these have these properties as distinct from those which have those other properties, and to say what are their relations. But when we go on to consider these things and properties and relations, each in isolation, as fixed constants, as mutually exclusive terms, then we begin to go wrong. For everything in the world has many different and indeed contradictory aspects, existing in intimate relationship with other things and not in isolation, and is subject to change. And so it frequently happens that when we classify something as A and not B, then this formula is upset by changing from A into B, or by its being A in some relationships and B in others, or by having a contradictory nature, part A and part B. For example, we all know the difference between birds and mammals. And that while birds lay eggs, mammals in general produce their young alive and suckle them. Naturalists used to believe that mammals were rigidly distinguished from birds because, among other things, mammals do not lay eggs. But this formula was completely upset when an animal called the platypus was discovered. For while the platypus is undoubtedly a mammal, it is a mammal which lays eggs. What is the explanation of this irregular behavior of the platypus? It is to be found in the evolutionary relationship of birds and mammals, which are both descended from original egg-laying animals. The birds have continued to lay eggs while the mammals stopped doing so, except for a few conservative animals like the platypus. If we think of animals and their evolution, their development, this appears very natural. But if we try, as the older naturalists tried, to make them fit into some rigid, fixed scheme of classification, then the products of evolution upset that classification. Again, an idea or a theory which was progressive in one set of circumstances, when it first arose, cannot for that reason be labeled progressive in an absolute sense, since it may later become reactionary in new circumstances. And isn't that the truth? I mean, that's part of what we're dealing with now when we look at what's considered Marxism, because which was seen as extraordinarily progressive, because it spoke at a particular time when the vast majority of the world lived under absolute colonial domination. And the basic social activity that was occurring in the world appeared to be that which rested on this base of colonialism, where the world was the world of Europe and Europeans. And so everything that was defined met, fit into the definitions based on that reality. But that was not the whole reality. Because again, as we've said, and as Marx said and dismissed, the whole capitalist system comes into existence and rests upon a foundation or a pedestal of slavery, pure and simple, in the so-called New World, which is what happened with Africans and indigenous people who were enslaved in under this emergent kind of social system. So while it may have been really progressive as it in somebody's brains as a theory, as the masses of people who colonized people regain our voices in the process of fighting for our lives and our existence, then what we begin to see is to try and hold on to the notion that the world has to be understood by the relationships that exist between the colonizers, some of whom may call themselves workers and some of whom may be the bourgeoisie. That proves to be a reactionary kind of understanding because the colonizers all were given birth. The whole colonial system, the capitalist system, was given birth by the emergence of colonialism, which came at the expense of the rights and freedoms and resources of those of us who are colonized. So, so again, an idea or a theory which was progressive in one set of circumstances when it first arose cannot, for that reason, be labeled progressive in an absolute sense, since it may later become reactionary in new circumstances. For instance, mechanistic materialism, when it first arose, was a progressive theory. Well, we cannot say that it is still progressive today. On the contrary, under the new circumstances which have arisen, mechanistic theory has become retrograde, reactionary. Mechanism, which was progressive in the rising phase of capitalism, goes hand in hand with idealism as part of the ideology of capitalism in decay. And if you can really apply this whole concept of mechanistic materialism to what some refer to today as Marxism, in terms of how the world is understood as being comprised of just these different countries and peoples existing in a kind of existing in similar spaces or even in different spaces, sometimes colliding and what have you, but not having a relationship. That we will be talking about more in terms of how, when we look at the limitations of a metaphysical way of thinking. We go with Cornforth, who says common sense too recognizes the limitation of a metaphysical way of thinking. For example, when is a man bald? Common sense recognizes that though we can distinguish bald men from non-bald men, nevertheless, baldness develops through a process of losing one's hair. And therefore, men in the midst of this process into a phase in which we cannot say absolutely either that they are bald or that they are not. They are in a process of becoming bald. The metaphysical either or breaks down. In all of these examples, we are confronted with this distinction between an objective process in which something undergoes change and the concepts in terms of which we try to sum up the characteristics of things involved in the process. Such concepts never do and never can always in all respects correspond to their objects, precisely because the objects are undergoing change. See, this is what is being talked about here. It said that when is a person bald? A person can be in a state of losing his hair and cannot be considered that person as bald. There's a process that's going on here. And so that is an objective process. Then the concepts in terms of which we try to sum up the characteristics of the things involved in this process is another thing, because the concepts never do and never can always in every respect, as Cornforth says here, correspond to their objects precisely because the objects are undergoing change. Thus Engels writes, and we're quoting Engels here, are the concepts that prevail in natural science fictions because they by no means always coincide with reality. From the moment we accept the theory of evolution, all our concepts of organic life correspond only approximately to reality. Otherwise, there would be no change. On the day that concept and reality absolutely coincide in the organic world, develop is at an end. Quote. So all we're saying is that the concepts in science, in natural science, these concepts fiction because they don't always coincide with reality. And from the moment we talk about and recognize and accept the theory of evolution, that all the concepts of organic life correspond only approximately to reality. Only approximately. The person, when is a person bald? We're talking an approximation because the person in the process of losing hair at some juncture is neither bald or not bald. So when you talk about this person today and say that this person is not bald, then you haven't lied, because months or years later, the same person who's involved in this process clearly is bald, clearly has lost the hair. So it's to say that it's fiction because it doesn't coincide exactly with reality is to have a mechanistic viewpoint. The fact is that there's change involved in these processes all the time, and our consciousness and imagination have to be open to recognition of these changes. Otherwise, we will never get anything right, and we'll expect the things to remain the same forever when that is not going to happen. And this is, of course, an error that's made all the time by the colonizer, who assumes that things will remain the same all the time. In the first place, has already come up with wrong categories for everything in terms of how to understand them. And secondly, it presupposes that things will always remain just as they are. Otherwise, if they didn't think that, it's almost a necessity for them to think that, because otherwise they would be able to see their own demise down the future, which is in the future, which is one of the reasons that it is so difficult for them to accept the dialectical approach, because it actually does not meet. It does not meet their own requirements. It challenges and predicts their own inevitable demise as a social force. The colonizer is in the process of being wiped out. Every Venezuela is a threat to the existence of the colonizer. Every Iran, every Iraq, every Palestine, every rebellion that happens in North St. Louis or in Houston, Texas, or on the continent of Africa challenges this reality. So it's much more comfortable to have this approach, a non-dialectical, metaphysical way of understanding things that presupposes that cannot accept the reality that everything that exists in a process of coming into being and dying out in relationship to all other kinds of things within that process. So, and at the point where as Engels said, the day that the concept and reality absolutely coincide in the organic world, development is at an end. At the point that there is a really unity of reality and the concept, then it means that development is at an end, because it means that the process of becoming bald, which is a process of development, is over. And it means that what comes with that is death and etc. So he pointed out that similar considerations apply to all concepts without exception. So we go now to the unity and struggle of opposites, which is really important. When we think of the properties of things, their relationships, their modes of action and interaction, the processes into which they enter then we find that generally speaking, all these properties, relationships, interactions, and processes divide into fundamental opposites. For example, if we think of the simplest ways in which two bodies can act on one another, then we find that this action is either repulsion or attraction. If we consider the electrical properties of bodies, then there is positive and negative electricity. In organic life, there's the building up of organic compounds and the breaking down of them. Again, in mathematics, there is addition and subtraction, plus and minus. And in general, whatever sphere of inquiry we may be considering, we find that it involves such fundamental opposites. We find ourselves considering not just a number of different things, different properties, different relationships, different processes, but pairs of opposites, fundamental oppositions, as Hegel put it. In opposition, the different is not confronted by any other, but by its other. Thus, we think of the forces acting between two bodies. There are not just a number of different forces, but they divide into attractive and repulsive forces. If we think of electric changes, there are not just a number of different charges. If we think of electric charges, rather, there are not just a number of different charges, but they divide into positive and negative, and so on. Attraction stands opposed to repulsion, positive electricity to negative electricity. Such fundamental oppositions are not understood by the metaphysical way of thinking. In the first place, the metaphysical way of thinking tries to ignore and discount opposition. It seeks to understand given subject matter simply in terms of a whole number of different properties and different relations of things, ignoring the fundamental oppositions which are manifested in these properties and relations. Thus, those who think in metaphysical terms about class-divided societies, for example, try to understand society as consisting merely of a large number of different individuals connected together by all kinds of different social relations. But they ignore the fundamental opposition of exploiters and exploited, manifested in all those social relations. So this is an important point, again, we talk about here in the first place, the metaphysical way of thinking tries to ignore and discount opposition, wants to discount opposition. It seeks to understand given and subject matter simply in terms of a whole number of different properties and different relations of things, ignoring the fundamental oppositions which are manifested in those properties and relations. Thus, those who think in metaphysical terms about class-divided societies, for example, try to understand society as consisting merely of a large number of different individuals connected together by all kinds of different social relations, but they ignore the fundamental opposition of exploiters and exploited manifested in all those social relations. And that's part of what we run into when we look at the so-called democratic socialists and the Bernie Sanders kind of people who want to see society in this fashion and see a society being able to change by offering up raise in the amount of money that is acquired by the workers or the healthcare and things like that might be available to the worker without being able to acknowledge that the relationship that the worker has with those who would be providing the raise is one of exploitation, that the worker is exploited, that we look in a society where exploitation of the class is a fundamental question, and that a society which has come into existence based on fundamentally on the exploitation of the colonized by the colonizer. You just can't talk about these different things. You come up and, as people do all the time, they talk about the differences. They every time there's a rebellion in this country, you see bleeding hearts, liberal bleeding hearts, and social democrats and things like that, and liberals of every stripe who talk about then the difference in the incomes of Africans and white people and the health of accessibilities, the healthcare accessibilities, the educational, et cetera, et cetera. They talk about all those things as if they were just things, but they don't talk about the fundamental question, and that is the relationship of exploitation and exploited, oppressed and oppressors. That colonialism requires both the existence of both the oppressor and the oppressed. You can't talk about all of these things that happen to African people without being able to say that Africans live under a severe kind of exploitation that can only exist through severe oppression. So Africans do not exploit and oppress ourselves, then the exploitation must be coming from someplace else. The oppression must be coming from someplace else. So the metaphysical way of seeing things is determined not to recognize the relationship between exploiting exploiters, between oppressed and oppressors, between the colonizer and the colonized, but they would just like to speak of those things as just factors that exist in society. So they will recognize that some people don't get enough money, don't get enough to eat, that some people are beaten up and brutalized by the cops more, et cetera. But they want to just leave it like that without being able to dig further and explain that what we're looking at is a relationship within this process, expose a particular kind of relationship between the oppressed and oppressed, or the colonized and the colonized. So we say that they talk about how those who think in metaphysical terms about class divided societies, for example, try to understand society as consisting merely of a large number of different individuals connected together by all kinds of different social relations, but they ignore the fundamental opposition of exploiters and exploited manifest in all those social relations. And here Cornforth is incapable of recognizing that all the social relations that we talk about and all of the relations of exploiting exploiters are relationships that are contained within a colonial capitalist social system that is self-defined by exploitation of the colonized by their colonizers. In the second place, when the metaphysical way of thinking does nevertheless come upon the fundamental opposition and cannot ignore them, then true to his habit of thinking of each thing in isolation as a fixed constant, it considers these opposites each in isolation from the other, understand them separately, and as such, and as each excluding the other. Thus, for example, the older physicists used to think of positive and negative electricity just simply as two different electric fluids. But contrary to metaphysics, not only are fundamental opposites involved in every subject matter, but these opposites mutually imply each other, are inseparably connected together, and far from being exclusive, neither can exist or be understood except in relation to the other. This characteristic of opposition is known as polarity. Fundamental opposites are polar opposites. A magnet, for example, has two poles, the North Pole and the South Pole. But these poles, opposite and distinct, cannot exist in separation if the magnet is cut in two. There's not, there's not a North and South, North Pole in each half and the South Pole in the other, in one half and the South Pole in the other, but North and South Pole poles recur in each half. The North Pole exists only as the opposite of the South, and vice versa. The one can be defined only as the opposite of the other. In general, fundamental opposition has to be understood as polar opposition. Fundamental opposition has to be understood as polar opposition. And every subject matter has to be understood in terms of the polar opposition involved in it. Thus, in physics, we find that attraction and repulsion are involved in every physical process in such a way that they cannot be separated or isolated one from the other. In considering living bodies, we do not find in some cases the building up of organic compounds, and other cases they're breaking down, but every life process involves both the building up and breaking down of organic compounds. In capitalist society, the increasing socialization of labor is inseparable from its opposite, the increasing centralization of capital. The unity of opposites, the fact that opposites cannot be understood in separation one from another, but only in their inseparable connection. Every field of investigation is strikingly exemplified in mathematics. And then here, Cornforth gives us some fundamental operations of two opposites in mathematics. He says that the unity of, and you can see them here, the unity of opposites, their inseparable connection, is by no means to be understood as a harmonious and stable relationship, as a state of equilibrium. On the contrary, the unity of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The unity of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposites, is absolute, just as development and motion are absolute. Let's look at this. So when we talk about the unity of opposites, and that's what we're talking about here. And this is something that's very difficult for some people, especially metaphysicians, to understand. This relationship between that exists inside processes, this relationship between opposites, this concept of the unity of opposites, where the fact of the matter is, as we've said before, you can't think of colonized without thinking of a colonizer. That's the unity of opposites. You have a colonizer, you have the colonized. You have up, you have down. You can't understand one without being able to understand the other. You need the other for you need one for the definition of the other. In every case, you need each for the definition of the other. Up and down requires the existence of both. There's a unity of opposites. There's up and down are opposites, in and out, opposites. But they require each other for their definition. Oppressed and oppressor, opposites. And that's what we're looking at. So there's this unity of opposites. But it also says that here, the unity of opposites, their inseparable connection, their connection is by no means to be understood as harmonious and stable relationship, as a state of equilibrium. On the contrary, the unity of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute, just as development and motion are absolute. That's why we talk about an uneasy equilibrium that we can see happening here today, that this struggle between the opposites involved in this relationship, this defined, that requires each side for its definition and its existence. This struggle between the oppressor nation and the oppressed nation. You have this definition of oppressed and oppressor because this condition of colonial mode of production requires the existence of each for its own definition. It can't exist without both of them. You can't have a colonial mode of production without having colonized and the colonizer. So the thing is that most people who are entering into political life and struggle don't necessarily recognize this relationship and have the ability of seeing what we are looking at as some kind of permanent thing that does not, without recognizing that each requires the existence of the other for its existence. And that if you destroy colonialism, you kill the colonizer, then what you do is kill colonialism, because you can't have the colonized without the colonized. And this is a relationship, again, it's transitory, it's a relative relation. This unity is transitory and relative. The struggle is mutually exclusive opposite. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposite is absolute. It's absolute struggle, just as development and motion are absolute. But development and motion occur, and the struggle of the mutually exclusive opposites occur within the context of development and motion. So the existence of fundamental polar opposites manifesting themselves in every department of nature and society expresses itself in the conflict and struggle of opposed tendencies, which, despite phases of temporary equilibrium, lead to continued motion and development, to a perpetual coming into being and passing away of everything in existence, to chart changes of states and transformation. Thus, for example, the equilibrium of attractive and repulsive forces in the physical world is never more than conditional and temporary. The conflict and struggle of attraction and repulsion always asserts itself, issuing in physical changes and transformations, whether transformation on an atomic scale, chemical change, or on a grand scale in the explosion of stars. To sum up, metaphysics thinks in terms of ready-made things whose properties and potentialities metaphysics thinks in terms of ready-made things whose properties and potentialities it seeks to fix and determine once and for all, and considers each thing by itself in isolation from every other, in terms of irreconcilable antithesis, either or. It contrasts one thing to another, one property to another, one relationship to another, not considering things in their real movement and interconnection, and not considering that every subject matter represents a unity of opposites, opposed but inseparably connected together. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics refuse to think of things each by itself as having a fixed nature and fixed properties, either or, but it recognizes that things come into being, exist, and cease to be in a process of unending change and development, in a process of complicated and ever-changing interrelationship in which each thing exists only in its connection with other things and goes through a series of transformations, and in which is always manifested the unity, inseparable interconnection and struggle of the opposite properties, aspects, tendencies, characteristics of every phenomena of nature and society. Contrary to metaphysics, the aim of dialectics is to trace the real changes and interconnections in the world, and to think of things always in their motion and interconnection. And here we have a quote from Lenin, and another quote from Marx around this. And the basic point, though, that I really want to draw out here is how many of the liberals and leftists and progressive thinkers, and some of whom call themselves Marxists, really missed the boat because this method of analysis of the world, this metaphysical approach to analysis is something that is beneficial to the ruling class who hates change, who fears change, and in whose interest it is to deny change, and who places himself in the center in a certain way, can't recognize the relationship of other people, can't recognize, for example, the wealth of whiteness in Europe. And when I say Europe, I'm talking about whiteness and white people, et cetera, and the relationship between the wealth of whiteness and the poverty of Africans and other peoples around the world. They can't recognize that. It's almost impossible for them to do that without the intervention by the colonized ourselves, that intruding into their lives in a way that what they perceive of the world is changed by our presence. And so, I mean, that's something that we see all the time, whether it's from left wing, from the communists, from all these other forces, just the refusal to be able to see it's mechanistic, yes, but it is a metaphysical way of abstraction of seeing the world that does not take into consideration the development and the relationships that exist. And because to recognize the existing relationships is to recognize that the well-being of the colonizer, of white people, if you will, and anybody who might fit into the category of a colonizer, or any society that fits into the category of being a colonizer society, lives at the expense of those who are colonized. And so rather than recognize that, even though there's this discussion of recognizing the poverty that is in Africa, the poverty in African communities, coincidentally, the poverty in these concentration camps that's called Indian reservations, the poverty in the barrios, the poverty of all the people in the world, there's an absolute refusal and inability to recognize the fundamental relationship here, that this poverty that is seen is a consequence of the wealth that we see with the colonizer. And in this relationship that we are talking about now, all economic activity, production occurring in the world happens within, all fundamental within this relationship. And there was a time when there was a real understanding and movement that was trying to overturn this kind of social system, even if it was not clearly understood. And that put all of these forces on really progressive trajectory, because they were denying the validity of the social system, that the capitalist system, the exploitation, et cetera, that, and recognizing that the freedom of human beings could only come about as a consequence of overthrowing that. Today, we see a contest that's happening, but it's primarily a contest that is existing within, with different forces trying to take advantages over others within the existing kind of colonial mode of production, not to overturn the colonial mode of production, or if it is to overturn the colonial mode of production, it is something that happens as a consequence of some kind of gradual, if you will, or how do we put it, changes, incremental changes that happen that might lead to some great leap at some later point. But anyway, that's part of what I wanted to put forward. And Comrade Akile, where are we now? Should we leave it now, or?
I think we should wrap this section up because it'll.
Splendid. Let's do that. Okay. All right. So
page 65, where it says thus Ingalls writes, just to continue that.
Okay, page 65. Okay. So take us forward.
Oh, Chair, I was saying you should read this. I'm sorry.
Oh, you want me to read further? Okay.
Yes, and just
that's what you meant by wrapping it up.
Yes, yes, sorry.
Okay, gotcha, Comrade. Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, I didn't understand you. I was wrapping it up. Okay. So change and interconnection. The Marxist dialectical method demands that we must always consider things not in isolation, but in their interconnection with other things in relation to the actual conditions and circumstances of each case, and that we must consider things in their change and movement. They're coming into being and going out of being, always taking particularly into account what is new, what is rising and developing. It follows that the Marxist dialectical method forbids the employment of ready-made schemes and abstract formulas, but demands a thorough, detailed analysis of a process in all its concreteness, basing its conclusion only on such an analysis. And so here we go to 4 principal features of what is considered the Marxist dialectical method. In his Dialectical and Historical Materialism, Stalin said that there are 4 principal features of the Marxist dialectical method. 1, contrary to metaphysics, dialectics does not regard nature as just an agglomeration of things, each existing independent of the others, but it considers things as connected with, independent on, and determined by each other. Hence, it considers that nothing can be understood taken by itself in isolation, but must always be understood in its inseparable connection with other things and as conditioned by them. That's really important to understand. Inseparable with other, a separate connection with other things and conditioned by them. 2, contrary to metaphysics, dialectics consider everything as in a state of continuous movement and change, a renewal and development, where something is always arising and developing, and something always disintegrating and dying away. Hence, it considers things not only from the standpoint of their interconnection and interdependence, but also from the standpoint of their movement, their change, their development, their coming into being and going out of being. 3, contrary to metaphysics, dialectics does not regard the process of development as a simple process of growth, but as a development which passes from quantitative changes to open fundamental changes to qualitative changes, which occur abruptly, taking the form of a leap from one state to another. Hence, it considers development as an onward and upward movement, as a transition from an old qualitative state to a new qualitative state, as a development from the simple to the complex, from the lower to the higher. 4, contrary to metaphysics, dialectics holds that the process of development from the lower to the higher takes place as a disclosure of the contradictions inherent in things, as a struggle of opposite tendencies which operate on the basis of these contradictions. We shall postpone until the next chapter consideration of the latter 2 features, which consider the process of development from one qualitative state to another, from the lower to the higher. In this chapter, we shall consider the first 2 features of the dialectical method, namely that it considers things always in their interconnection and their movement and change. So, okay.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I really just want to appreciate this study, and I think others who are tuning in would like to as well. It's just been really profound, continuing to go through this piece with on Maurice Cornforth presented on Dialectical Materialism, and how African internationalism is really the advanced theory, out in the world, explaining the conditions of the world and the inception, the origin of this whole social system that we find ourselves operating in and organizing to overturn. So thank you, Chairman, for this study. And we're going to go ahead now and get into our Q&A portion. But before we actually take your questions, and please be typing them into the Facebook and YouTube chat sections, we're going to go to our announcements first, just to let you guys know what's going on in our movement, touching on things like the plenary that the chairman mentioned just a moment ago. So this study is being brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, where we're winning the war of ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com. And you can get more political education from Chairman Omali Yeshitela in every issue of the Burning Spear newspaper. Become a subscriber today, get a 1-year subscription, 12 issues delivered straight to your door or email inbox for $25. Gift a subscription to comrades and family members, and sponsor a prisoner subscription. You can do all of this at theburningspear.com/subscribe. Calling on Spear distributors, last call for this December Spear, and you can pre-order bundles of the January issue now. Get the Spear out in your community. Go to burningspearmarketplace.com. This Wednesday, December 22nd, marks the 53rd anniversary of the Burning Spear newspaper. To celebrate, Burning Spear Media will be having a special live sale on Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. We will have surprise items for auction from the archive and special deals when you tune in. Tune in on the Burning Spear's Facebook page and YouTube channel. Omali Taught Me airs on Black Power 96 FM radio, a project of the African People's Education and Defense Fund, with the slogan, not just explaining the world, but changing it. Listen on 96.3 FM in St. Petersburg, Florida, or streaming online at blackpower96.org and on the free Black Power 96 mobile app. If you have not downloaded our app, what is you doing? Download it at your Google Play Store, your Apple App Store, Black Power 96, to tune in to this bad radio station, no matter where it is you're located. The theory of African internationalism is a theory of practice. All the energy of the African People's Socialist Party is focused on the destruction of colonial capitalism. Africans of the world, go to our website, apspuhuru.org, and fill out our contact form. On Wednesday, January 29th at 6 p.m. Central, join the African People's Solidarity Committee as they host a discussion with Chairman Omali Yeshitela about the 50th anniversary of the African People's Socialist Party. Register to join the Zoom room at tinyurl.com/reparations and socialism. calling on all party and Uhuru movement members and supporters. Attend the 2022 plenary conference of the African People's Socialist Party, February 11th through the 14th, 2022. Our plenaries and congresses have become the vehicles for an ongoing assessment of our work and the conditions in the world affecting our struggle for total liberation and unification of every square inch of Africa and the entire globally dispersed African nation. This event is virtual. Registration for the 4-day conference costs just $25. Read the full call to attend by Chairman Omali Yeshitela and register by going to apspplenary.org. Like and follow the Lowezi Kinshasa Like page on Facebook for more African internationalist political education. Secretary General Lowezi Kinshasa does frequent live events, such as the War of Ideas series. He includes live sessions done in French. To get alerts of when SG Lowezi is going live, make sure to like and follow his page today. Uhuru Foods and Pies is hiring for a part-time baker in both Oakland, California, and St. Petersburg, Florida. Culinary training is preferred. Join the work to build an independent African economy by baking for Black power. To apply, email your resume to oakland.volunteer@uhurufoods.org or mail a resume to 7911 MacArthur Boulevard, Oakland, California, 94605, or call 800-578-5157 for more information. Uhuru Furniture and Collectibles in both Oakland and Philly are hiring full-time truck drivers and full-time marketing coordinators. Do you have driving and furniture lifting skills, social media and print marketing experience, and can you work Wednesday through Sunday? If so, apply for these positions and contribute your labor and skills to this institution of the African People's Education and Defense Fund. Apply by visiting their website in Oakland, uhurufurniture.blogspot.com, and in Philadelphia, that's uhurufurniturephilly.blogspot.com. On Tuesday nights from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern, join Ralph Pointer on What's Happening Blog Talk Radio. Tune in by calling 347-857-3293. Ralph Pointer sits on the Black is Back Coalition Steering Committee and chairs the BIBC's Political Prisoners Working Group and also leads the Lynn Stewart Committee. And we're calling on people to follow the All African People's Development and Empowerment Project on Facebook or visit developmentforafrica.org for important information and helpful tips in regards to the colonial virus COVID-19. APDEP has an international telehealth program, which is a free resource for African people to get our COVID-19 related questions and concerns answered by licensed doctors and nurses through Project Black Ankh. You can make your free virtual appointment with one of their professional health providers by going to developmentforafrica.org/telehealth. To keep up with our movement events, visit theburningspear.com's events page and subscribe to our mailing list. And our last announcement, make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study and support the Omali Taught Me show by donating now at paypal.me/OmaliTaughtMe. So that concludes our announcements for today. Thank you guys for your patience. And now we're going to get into the Q&A portion of our program. Of course, we want to acknowledge where people are viewing from. We have St. Louis, Missouri, St. Petersburg, Florida, Miami, Florida, Battle Creek, Michigan, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Oakland, California, Portland, Oregon, Chicago, Illinois, Marion County, Georgia, occupied Azania or South Africa, Tampa, Florida, Ghana, Fort Myers, Florida, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Lakeland, Florida, Hempstead, New York, Greenville, South Carolina, Gainesville, Florida, Huntsville, Alabama, UK, and Toronto, Canada. So Uhuru comrades, thank you all for tuning in. And Chairman, our first question comes from Comrade Life in Tampa, Florida. He asked, Uhuru Chairman, your presentation, if Jesus was a revolutionary, why is your preacher such an Uncle Tom, took biblical Jesus, whose existence people often admire in metaphysics, and highlighted his existence in historical materialist terms. The presentation was brilliant and powerful. Why was it important for you to use biblical Jesus to make an ideological struggle against the abstractions of metaphysicists' views of Jesus, churches, and preachers?
Thank you, Comrade Life. It's good to hear from you. I think that one of the significant things about what we're doing right now with this study and why it's really so important for Africans, African internationalists, for people in our movement to really come to own this method of investigation and analysis is that it allows us to speak to our people in language and using examples that people are familiar with. And we know that what has happened with African people in part is an assault on the belief system of African people has been made from a lot of different angles. And one of the most impressive and significant was through Christianity. And Christianity was something that functioned, and I'm not necessarily talking about historical Christianity. I mean, I know a lot about much of it being rooted in Africa, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is that Christianity, like almost every other thing in the possession of the oppressor, has been something that's waged struggle against African people. And so the thing is that they've attempted to do this, they have done this, generally speaking, quite effectively. When I came to know of Christianity, it was the African people had adopted this religion as a religion of the oppressed. And we call it religion because I don't know a better word right now to use for it, but as something of the oppressed. And I mean, all kinds of messages and things like that were provided to us that encouraged fighting back, resistance, encouraged us to believe that we could have a victorious outcome as a child. You know, my grandmother constantly provided me stories of Samson and who slew, you know, I forgot how many thousands with the jawbone of an ass, and of Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his own brothers and what have you, and came to be this magnificent leader. So my grandmother was teaching me these stories, arming me, and this was a safe way to talk to us because the oppressor, you know, really in many ways promoted religion. And so this was an instrument that we were using to try and resist. It was the oppressor's intent to use it to subdue us and to attack whatever belief systems that were necessary for that we had evolved. So we take the same belief system that people are mired in, and sometimes it has now trapped people in a way that we become reliant on preachers who have a different kind of relationship to the social system than the master of us. In fact, they're sort of social parasites who live off the labor and struggle of other people. And this is not something I'm saying in a pejorative way. It's just an objective truth that they don't, generally speaking, that they are not forces that produce value and wealth themselves. They benefit from the value, whatever, of the most oppressed sector of the population, as well as others. And so we intrude in this process by raising up the question. We take the Jesus that's being used to disarm people, to turn the other cheek and to lay on your belly and grovel in front of white power, and we give it a historical context. A historical materialist context, that this Jesus that you speak to existed during a time where the primary relations were defined by Roman colonialism to much of the world that was being colonized by Rome, and that Yeshua, or the Jesus person who you talked about at that time, was part of one of a number of different kinds of institution and organization that existed with Hebrew people to resist Roman domination, and which is only sort of casually mentioned throughout much of what you will read in terms of biblical history, and of course that's what we saw with the rise of Jesus, who was actually an organizer, this Jesus, against Roman colonialism. And if you know when you read this and understand the context within which the relationship exists between Hebrews and Romans, then you understand, you have a much better grasp. You can provide a much better grasp to the people of what Jesus was about. You disarm those who would try and utilize this Jesus figure as something to disarm the masses of the people. And you're able to quote, according to the biblical Jesus, that I didn't come bring the peace, I came bringing the sword. And you have him quoted as saying, remember when I told you if you had a cloak that, you should sell it, you should sell it and get resources to get a sword with it that you have to fight. And this was, against colonialism. And we use all kinds of examples that's in the Gospels, this New Testament of how this was related to resistance to Roman colonialism. And so that's part of it. It's a familiar story. So really, Africans are really familiar with the story, and you can take it and you can give it a materialist. You can provide a materialist explanation that can arm people and lead them out of the trap of a certain kind of idealistic relationship to this Jesus figure that the oppressor attempts to use to prevent us from struggle. You can give it a historical materialist analysis and give it back to the people in a different form that is true, that to the conditions that existed in the world, and it parallels in many ways the existence that African people are confronted with today in the world with our own Rome that essentially is the United States, which is the big empire. So that's what we try to do with that life. And also in the process of doing that, we take a swipe at opportunism and neocolonialism in our own communities. Like preachers have access to this information. Some of them actually go to institutions where they've learned various things about the historical history of the religion, and yet they don't inform the people, generally speaking, about the revolutionary project, the revolutionary character of this Yeshua, this person who they call Jesus, and they allow it to be, because that's a process that still, provides resources for the preachers as well. So we say, if Jesus was a revolutionary, why is your preacher such an Uncle Tom? And of course your preacher's an Uncle Tom because he's wedded not to the revolutionary Jesus, but he's wedded to the counter-revolutionary Rome. In this instance, the colonial capitalist system that we suffer from. Uhuru. Life, thank you for the question.
Uhuru, thank you, Life, for your question, and thank you, Chairman. And that was just another brilliant presentation that you made that you can find on the Burnings for TV YouTube channel. So if Jesus was a revolutionary, why is your preacher an Uncle Tom? And our next question comes from Comrade Zayero, who is in Battle Creek, Michigan. And he asks, and quotes from Maurice Cornforth, the unity of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. Is this also a term used in love-hate relationships as with opposites attract, and is this common nature?
Well, I think we've gone through this process about nature. And if you say common nature, you're talking about human beings, much of that relates to the kind of society. And when you even talk about things like love, hate, relationships, et cetera, this whole, the advent of sex love, romantic love is a relatively new phenomenon in human society that has created a whole bunch of confusion in human society, as it's something that presupposes itself to be applicable to all human societies, and that has not been the case. And so you have different kinds of relationships based on the nature of the kind of social system that one exists in, and what we characterize as love and things like that, jealousy and all of those other issues are reliant on the kind of social system that we exist in. So when people talk about this, however, you hear often this thing about love and hate and the some kind of unity of opposites in terms of relationships of love and hate, etc. Opposites attract, and I don't know how to take it much further than that. Perhaps if I were given a more specific kind of example of what is meant here, we could talk more about it. My wife frequently exhorts me to do a study again on love itself, which is worth considering. But even what we talk about here in terms of love and hate, etc., in relationships, again, in relationships or love-hate relationships, I think basically the principle of the unity of opposites, I think the principle is applicable. But I think it's really important to understand that when we talk about common nature, is this common nature around human relationships? That's a different kind of question. Sayero, Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Sayero, for posing the question. So Chairman, this next question, it's a little long. It's like several questions in one. So I'm going to try to get through it, but if you need me to stop or repeat things, I will do that. This is coming from Dwight on Facebook, and they are asking, so as an example of mechanistic materialism and idealism going hand in hand in an eclectic philosophy of colonial oppression, do we have the colonizer saying the strongest and fittest gain control and rule, which is mechanistic materialism? Then is the colonizer combining this with the idealism of Christianity, which allows slavery as punishment for the sin of paganism committed by the oppressed and accepts the Pope authorizing Portugal to enslave Africans and other indigenous people around the world due to their paganism? Third, the colonizer says Christianity then forgives the Christian colonizer for his sin of oppression when he confesses his sin before his God in Christianity, also convinces the oppressed to accept their oppression due to their sin, and that their oppressor is stronger and more righteous, and teaches the oppressed and the oppressor that they will be equal in heaven, thus blunting the need to engage in dialectical struggle on the part of the oppressed and elements of the colonizers who see the oppression as unacceptable. Would you agree this is how the colonizer has cobbled together mechanistic materialism and idealism, which allows them to believe they will remain in power?
Who is that from?
That's Dwight.
Dwight. I just want to say, Comrade Dwight, you've made a pretty interesting and detailed kind of statement. And basically what you've done is say how the colonizer is a dominant force in society, and that has the ability and uses it to define all of the relationships in society, and that this is something that can only be disrupted by the conscious activity of the oppressed, those who are exploited in this relationship and in this society. I mean, I think generally speaking, you have repeated much of what we've said here throughout this study. So I think that generally speaking, I unite with what you have just said. I think generally speaking, it was a pretty, kind of long and involved statement, but I think it moves to sum up what we've just talked about. But the fundamental thing here is that one of the reasons we're having this discussion is to arm ourselves, to make us more capable as an organized force to overturn the oppressor, the colonial master that defines this reality and puts us on a particular kind of trajectory that facilitates our own oppression. And the arms, the thing that the oppressor has going for him, the colonizer has going for him, is the state, the power of the state, the power to oppress the power of the gun, the power to lock people up and brutalize people, and then the power to affect the consciousness and what the oppressed believe in and think. These are two things that the state actually does. The colonial state has that power, and that's why it has to be destroyed. And that's what the anti-colonial revolution that we are engaged in pursuing all around the world is actually involved in destroying that kind of that system. That state is a really important entity that has to be removed from our lives. The pursuit of democracy, as people like to talk about it, this talk about metaphysics and metaphysical reasoning is that would make democracy mean the same thing to everybody, when the democracy of the colonizer requires the assault on any kind of democratic democracy for those who are being colonized. It comes into existence. The benefit of colonization for the colonizer is also democracy for the colonizer. And so the struggle of the colonized is a struggle against democracy. It is a struggle to destroy that form of the state, of the colonial state. And the fact is that democracy from the perspective of the colonized is something that is being realized as part of the process of destroying the colonial state. And democracy is a form of the state. And when we look at the colonizer, the form of the state, that democracy is just one aspect of it. It could be a fascist state and still be living under colonialism. So I think I just want to say that we're looking at a metaphysical description of reality that we are constantly involved in fighting against. And one aspect of that is the fight against the ideas that the colonizer, using the power of the colonial state, imposes on us through our schools and other means. So the struggle against colonialism is a struggle to destroy the capacity of philosophically and otherwise of the colonizer in our lives. Uhuru.
Chairman. Thank you. And Sayero he commented, or to deepen his question, I guess. He said, to be in depth with my question about love/hate and it being common nature in accordance to dialectical metaphysics, are we who have been indoctrinated and are always in internal conflict with acceptance or rejection of colonial conditions, prey to internal strife and sometimes confusion due to nature or the contradiction of what we have been taught, thus doomed to internal strife as we fight against colonial capitalism and imperialism? I don't know if that made it more clear, Chairman.
Prey to internal strife and sometimes confusion due to nature, one nature or the contradiction, or nature of the contradiction, what we've been taught against them to. Well, as long as the colonizer has control of our brains, that's why we engage in this discussion right now, Comrade Sayero. It's the process of recapturing our own brains. And as long as the colonizer has control of our brains, we've talked about dialectics, we talked about metaphysics, and we've talked about idealism as ways of investigating and explaining the world that are conservative and preserve the existing social order. We talk about how this is something that's necessary from those who benefit from the existing social system. And so obviously we have to make major assault on this process of investigating and analyzing the world. And that's what this is about right now. You know, I may be a little slow in terms of understanding exactly what you mean, but to be more specific about what I mean is that we are in dealing with this discussion right now in order to arm our people to make a war against colonialism, recognizing that colonialism against the whole colonial mode of production, and that the colonial mode of production itself produces a way of seeing and understand the world that serves colonialism and the colonizer and works against those of us who are colonized. Essentially, that's what I'm saying. And that works its way throughout virtually everything. The culture, the music, and even the concept of love, as we have come to understand it, affected by the fact that we live under this kind of domination. I suspect, you know, I suspect, you know, that what it is that you are conveying is correct, because it seems to be condemnatory of how we understand things and even how we relate to each other, and as a consequence of living under colonial domination. So I can unite with that. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Thank you, Sayero. And Dwight also has a follow-up question. He asks, once in power, will the party have to undergo continuous cultural revolution to prevent idealism and mechanistic materialism from taking root in the party and causing revisionism?
Well, the whole concept of dictatorship of the proletariat presupposes that it's absolutely going to be necessary for the working class to that's one of the reasons why there's such a thing as considered as socialism. As you know, socialism is that bridge that exists between colonial capitalism and the communism, that a stateless kind of society that we are struggling for, but it won't happen automatically and magically. And that the working class is going to have power in society. It has to become the new ruling class precisely because there's going to be a lot of work necessary in order to reorganize not only how production occurs in the society that we are building, but also how we understand the world. It's a whole different process that's going to have to come into existence. We're going to have to, there's going to be all kinds of residual implications and intervention by processes, thoughts, and things like that that have come with the colonial capitalist social system. So that's going to be necessary. And in terms of the party and the struggle against revisionism, that is something that is ongoing within the African People's Socialist Party, even before the achieving political power. And that is why there is within the party itself a basic organizational principle being democratic centralism is the application of the dictatorship of the proletariat inside the party itself to fend off and struggle all the time in order to preserve the revolutionary line in the party and to protect the party from the inevitable and ongoing intrusion by the African petty bourgeoisie and other class and national interests of African people. And as you may be aware, I mean, this happened and have to be aware that, you know, this is something that has happened in the party. We've had forces who've intervened in the party like that, and this is an ongoing process of struggle to evict it, to fight against the kind of revisionism that's being spoken of inside and outside the party. If you look at much of the history, in fact, when you look at the political report, I think that will be produced for this 50th anniversary of the party that will hopefully, you know, you'll have an opportunity to hear from within the next couple of weeks. You will see that much of the history of the African People's Socialist Party has been to make those kinds of ideological struggles within the overall anti-colonial movement of our people. It's a really important kind of struggle to make. And when we talk about, so I just wanted to say that. So when we see revisionism happening all the time, most of the time it's from outside the party. It's from people who we characterize sort of as pop theorists, theorists that whatever's popular, whatever's trending at the moment, they'll grab it. They function sort of as ideological chameleons. You know, they don't really believe in anything. Most of them are like careerists. They have careers in being Black, and they do that. But they will take things of the party's line that resonates. They would take some aspects of our theory that resonates with massive people, and they'll grab it and they'll try to use it as something against the people. They will mess with it, transform it to try to, and actually turn it into something against the people. That's a form of revisionism that we are constantly engaged in taking on. So anyway, comrade, I just wanted to say those things. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Again, that was Dwight with the follow-up question. And we're getting close to the end. Chairman, I'm going to take one more question. This is coming from Kimberly on Facebook. Kimberly asks, democracy can exist without oppression. Democracy by its very definition is without oppression, but oppression, as we have seen in modern society, can be allowed to exist within democracy as is socialist constructs. What form of government do you recommend?
First of all, I want to say democracy is a form of the state. And by its very definition, which came from Greek, from a Greek that has been hailed by European sociologists and many revolutionary as the prototype, as the template for democracy. It was a democracy where 80% of the people in that society were enslaved. Only 20% of the people were free. So democracy is something that's defined by the nature. It is a form of the state. And democracy for us as colonized people and all the colonized of the world is something that comes as a consequence of negating the colonial state into the existence of us as colonizers. In many ways, it is a fight against democracy. It's against the colonial democracy that comes at the expense of any rights and colonialism of African people ourselves. And so that's what we're talking about, that this is a form, that the democracy is a form of the state. Just like right now, Joe Biden and the Democratic Party in this ridiculous pursuit of a unity of the democracies against the autocracies. And so that the democracies would be the United States. It would include Israel killing Palestinians and stuff like that. The United States born through enslaving Africans, killing indigenous people, taking all this land and what have you. They are the templates. They got 100 and so persons who participate in the so-called democracy summit, that they identified who the democracies were. And then, of course, there was a part of that was about making a contest against Russia and China in particular, but other forces who do not fall within the orbit of US and Western imperialism. They are the autocracies. So it's democracy versus autocracy, according to Biden. But in the African People's Socialist Party, we understand that democracy is simply a form of the state. The democracy that we're talking about was creating on graveyards and genocide and enslavement of peoples, and it continues to be sustained, even if shakily so, of murder and brutality of peoples around the world. War, permanent warfare against the peoples of the world. That's the democracy. So it's a form of the state. Autocracy, as they're talking about, is a form of the state. That doesn't get to the essential question: who owns and controls the means of production? How do the people, whether it is owned and controlled by a mass of people who are the actual producers, that's the democracy that we're looking for. That's the only democracy that is acceptable. And there doesn't make sense to even speak of the question of democracy that does not have at the top of the list the destruction of colonialism and the colonial capitalist mode of production. That's what we're looking for. That's the way forward for democracy. And I really appreciate the question and intervention that was made by Comrade Kimberly. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Yes, thank you. And thank you, Kimberly, for your question. And Chairman, that's going to wrap us up for Q&A today. And so I just want to turn it back over to you for any closing statements before we go ahead and wrap up today's study. For real.
I want to just say two things, well, three things. One, thank you, Kimberly, for that question. I think it's important because it does speak to what we were talking about all along. And I hope I was clearer in my response than I have been throughout this process. When we talk about democracy, when we talk about a metaphysical approach to things, of somehow given this character to all things, a phenomena in society that is the same. Like, so you have democracy in general, which is no such thing as democracy in general. It's again, democracy for whom? And that's where it has always been. We talk about a definition. Whose definition of democracy? The Greeks' definition of democracy. In fact, the word democracy comes from the Greek. And it's based on this assumption of Greek democracy, ancient Greek democracy being the template for democracy that has defined, quote unquote, Western Europe. And this democracy, again, was a democracy of 20% of the population, while 80% of the people live under slavery. So that's what we're getting to. It's not just quibbling around words, but the fact is that the people are going to have power, that the struggle for democracy, the struggle really is about the destruction of colonial capitalism, the colonial mode of production that requires, as a condition for its existence, the oppression, the anti-democratic suppression of rights and freedoms of the colonized to the benefit of the colonizer. There is no other way that you can define and look at the whole question of democracy, equality, freedom, et cetera, other than that. So I want to say that, and thank you, Kim, for that. Another thing I wanted to do, comrades, is to share with you, many of you will not have heard that Comrade Charles Barron. Many of you are familiar with Comrade Charles Barron. He is an extraordinary friend of the party, a comrade, and he's my friend and comrade as well. His mother just passed the other day, and we just want to send out condolences and shouts of love to this comrade. And also, I want to let you know that he has just released a book, Speaking Truth to Power, articles and essays on revolution, Black radical politics and leadership. And so this book, I think, is available at Barnes and Noble. If people want to try to look it up and get it, don't call Charles to try to get the book, but the book is available. And I just wanted to acknowledge its existence. And we will probably be saying more about this book as we move forward in the next several days and weeks. And I want to thank all of you for being here. And I know that you must be some special people to spend the time that you've been spending looking at and listening to and talking to around this question of dialectical materialism, involving ourselves in an investigation discussion around political theory, which is extraordinarily important. And I'm calling on you again to really read further, look at the political reports to the African People's Socialist Party that's been made over the years, in particular the last two. And I think you will see the application of dialectical and historical materialism in solving problems, identifying contradictions, solving problems in the real world. So I wanted to say that and just express my appreciation for everybody being here. And with that, comrades, let's move forward, anticipate getting through this particular study so that we can begin a study, I hope, within the next 2 or 3 weeks of the political report to the third plenary of the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. My appreciation to everybody, and uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Well, again, just really want to express appreciation for this study, just salute your leadership, and want to thank all of you guys for tuning in, and as well unite with Chairman in saying that just appreciating all of you for following this whole study series on dialectical materialism. And we're so close to wrapping up this session, and I really look forward to studying the political report to the 2022 plenary, which reminder, you guys can register at apspplenary.org. So make sure you register February 11th through the 14th. It is virtual. You do not want to miss it.
11.
Again, uhuru. So thank you all.
Yeah, 11th to the 14th, uhuru.
Yes, uhuru. So thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday study, and to continue to support the OTM show by donating to paypal.me/Omali Taught Me. Thank you, Chairman. Uhuru, comrades. Vanguard up. Uhuru.
Vanguard up.